Hello my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to our /EntitledPeople, where people think they can do what they want, when they want, and nobody else matters. And in today's episode, we're dealing with nightmare renters, making their landlords miserable. And Opie tells a story about the time his dad destroys a renter's life because he wouldn't pay up. Guys, I hope you enjoy the stories. Don't shake your heads too hard, and as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. So I have a story from my dad, and he allowed me to share it here. This also happened a long time ago, when weed wasn't yet legal. So here's the story. My dad had tried his hand in renting out houses, albeit it's only one house and he had only one renter. My dad also has a soft heart, and he couldn't bear to force a family into the streets when rent wasn't paid. Now, this renter was one of his coworkers, and they were acquainted at best. The first month he lived there, things were great, but as the months went on, this work colleague took full advantage of my dad and his caring nature. This man would give every excuse in the book to not pay his rent, all of them relating to his toddler son. There was always medical bills for his son, formula, diapers, birthday gifts, so on and so forth. My dad accepted these excuses, allowing his colleague to delay payment, and never once tried to deduct from the deposit. Well, 6 months later, his renter decides to move out. It turns out the jackass bought himself a nice terrace house out in a good suburban area. The guy knew my dad was patient and a generous man, and he decided to take advantage of that. My dad, in his words, was pissed, but more than that, disappointed. He decided that he'll stop renting as he figured he would lose more than what he'll earn. Thus, the house was sold. Well, a few days later, my dad approaches his colleague, wanting to know why he stiffed him of his rent money. This took place in the middle of the lunchroom. My dad walks up to him and says, "Hey, I heard you bought a house. If you had money for the house, why couldn't you pay the rent?" The colleague tells him, "You know how my son keeps getting sick? Well, ever since I stayed at the house you rent, my son is always sick. He's always coughing." My dad asked, "So what's that got to do with me or that house?" This is when colleague tells him, "Well, your house probably has mold or something in the walls, so why should I pay for a home that's a hazard to mine and my son's health?" Now, this ticked my dad off. At this point, everyone had tuned into the drama being unfolded, and raising his voice, my dad laid down the truth bomb. My dad said, "I stayed in that house for 2 years with my wife and small children. Nothing happened. You know why your son keeps falling sick? Maybe it's when I went to inspect that house to sell it, the whole place reeked of weed. Every room in that house smells like marijuana. It's probably not the mold. Maybe it's poor parenting because you're hotboxing your kid in your house 24/7. Now, if you've ever been slammed by the truth so hard that it left you speechless, that's essentially what happened. The colleague was stunned. The guy didn't say a single word to my dad before turning around and walking away. My dad, having vented that, left to go do his own business. Colleague, not denying outright that he didn't do drugs, caused the rumor to spread like wildfire, with him ending up needing to do a drug test. Unsurprisingly, he failed that, which led to him being let go as the job site my dad worked at had a zero tolerance for drugs. Now you may think that's the end, but obviously, no job means no income. No income means he can't make the monthly installments for his new house. He fell behind. My dad found out that he was struggling for a while, and he ends up having to sell his new house because he couldn't make the high payments despite finding another job. The job that dad and him worked offered lots of overtime, which bumped his pay drastically. My dad said he never wanted to ruin his coworker's life like that. He told me he should have kept his mouth shut, but he was just so angry, and it was in the heat of the moment he said that. Dad never pressed to get his 6 months of rent money back. Honestly, I did not expect that much of a fallout. Like, talk about karma, right? The guy definitely abused OP's dad's generosity, and he ends up answering for it in the end. And you really have to wonder, with how sleazy that coworker was his son really sick and he was just using that as an excuse to avoid paying rent? Who knows? That said though, do you guys believe that what happened to coworker was fair? Did he deserve to lose his job and his house for taking advantage of someone's kindness? Let me know in the comments below. So this is a story about my parents around 7 or 8 years ago. First thing first, my parents owned 2 houses. They decided to keep the old house when they bought a new one so they could rent it out. The old house was in a decent area, but it was on the edge of a not-so-good part of the city, so it attracted a lot of the wrong crowd when my parents put it up for rent. After the horror story of the first tenant who used a dumb loophole in our state to live there for 6 months rent-free, my parents found a single woman with temporary foster kids who was interested. Let's call her Karen. The woman seemed really nice at first, housing kids who needed a home and selling homemade tacos from her taco cart. My parents did a background check. Everything signed, and she moves in with her kids immediately. And now, the wrongdoing. So Karen had decided to take in a lot more kids, given that our house was larger than her previous one. And I have nothing against these kids, they're just victims, but they tore that house to shreds. I remember countless times going with my dad to the house and handing him tools, while he fixed a variety of broken things. Holes in the walls, sink faucets getting snapped off, porcelain toilets getting cracked, and that's just some stuff. Eventually my dad had enough, and he told her that all the maintenance he was doing was 1, not required since the house was in perfect condition when she moved in, and was not due to anything on my parents' part. And number 2, caused by way too many kids in the house. And this pissed off Karen to the point that she stopped paying her rent. And here's some backstory. My dad's fair and reasonable, and I've never seen him give attitude to anyone, let alone yell. My mother, however, is a woman who doesn't take crap from anyone. So that being said, when my mom took me with her to pick up the rent, Karen then said some nasty things to my mom, and she kind of lost it. The screaming match was awful, but there was no physical contact on either end. It just ends with Karen basically stating that she wasn't going to pay a cent until Dad comes back and continues doing all the maintenance he was doing prior. She was dead serious about this, and my parents decide to take her to court. My parents were of course pissed because this was the second time a tenant had gotten away without paying rent. At this point, my mom wasn't going to let a freeloading, lazy, entitled woman take advantage of us. So the first thing she did was head to child services with photos of the house condition, courtesy of my father, who always took photos of the house when he went over for maintenance. They told my parents they would look into it. Next, my parents got a lawyer who collected all the photos we took before she moved in, to prove the house's condition before she moved in. Now, I wasn't in the courtroom, but from what my dad told me, it was the most satisfying thing he's ever seen. Karen's lawyer was a huge joke, and was obviously the cheapest and most inexperienced lawyer she could find. Karen and her lawyer basically tried lying for every point they made, where my dad and his lawyer simply pulled out a photo or message, completely destroying their argument. Eventually, she was contradicting herself, and the judge rules in my parents' favor. Now, my parents knew they weren't going to see a dime from Karen, given that she no longer could house the kids. But here's another thing. Because of us, it was found out that she was using her mom's name in order to house even more kids, which explains why they were given to her from the start. So she was going to answer to that too. Lastly, just to put the cherry on the cake, my parents put a lien on her taco cart, so she couldn't make money that way either. It's a funny thing in this case because the cart might have enabled her to pay the debt, but I don't know the details. And this might not be crazy entitled like the other stories on here, but you need to understand my parents are hardworking people who made something of themselves when given nothing. Piece of crap people should not take advantage of hardworking people. Well, frickin' sad OP. And seriously, OP's mom is frickin' badass for going the mile to take down this entitled renter. And honestly, I hope Karen pays for everything she did because that woman is scum. Like, I feel so bad for the kids. Like, they're already in a horrible situation being in the foster care system, and then they just end up getting used to get more money from the state. Like, absolutely heartbreaking, and I hope Karen does answer for everything she did. So I'm a small-time landlord with just 4 tenants. Earlier this year, I had 2 sisters that didn't respond to my request to add one of the gal's husbands to the lease, even though he was living with them. Now, that's not a big deal, but did I mention the pit bull they also brought home without permission? I do allow pets and had previously approved their other dog. I had asked nicely in person and by email in the months leading up to the malicious compliance. They also didn't respond when I asked if they were happy there and wanted to renew their lease for the following year. So I asked again and then emailed them the notice that I would start showing the unit 2 days later. I try to be a nice landlord, I do. They had a newborn as well, so I scheduled all of the showings within a 2-hour window on the same night, so I could be in their space as little as possible. Also, because they had not responded and it was now serious crunch time for getting another tenant and my spouse worked the following 2 weeks during evening showing hours, I had the delightful inconvenience of bringing my 2- and 6-year-old kids with me to the showings. Because I'm not a corporation, I'm a small-time family landlord with kids. Just try to imagine how difficult it is to conduct business meetings with 2 kids, right? And then imagine staggering showings every 15 minutes with prospective clients who are also bringing their own kids. And just to further clutter your imagination, this is an 800 square foot, 2-bedroom apartment with a cozy entryway. So I arrive with my 2 kids to find that my tenants are still at home, along with the husband, the newborn, and the other sister's boyfriend. So that's 7 people in a small kitchen already. And then the first prospective tenants start arriving. Husbands, wives, kids, and some are showing up early, so there's 2 sets of them. That's 14 people in a small kitchen. So I'm holding my toddler and my daughter safely under the dining table coloring. I'm just chatting with the prospective tenants and directing traffic while my actual tenants prepare to depart. And if you don't know this already, it's common practice in the US to leave the premises during real estate or apartment showings. This was their first apartment, so I actually emailed them ahead of time to let them know what's generally expected at showings. Just things like have a tidy apartment and they can leave for their own convenience. They do eventually leave, after the boyfriend tells a prospective tenant that he, in fact, also lives there. I just carry on with an exhausting scheduling of showings, and then have my new tenants all picked out and a lease signed by the next day, which is awesome, right? Well, the next night, I get a voicemail from the husband who's not my tenant. I saved it and just listened to it again because it still gives me the same delightful shiver of malicious compliance. In the husband's voicemail, he told me how awful it was that my children touched his infant's things, which they didn't, and how they had to sterilize everything to keep their infant from being sick, and how inconvenient it was to have showings with only 2 days' notice, and how unprofessional I was to bring my own kids. He then ends the voicemail by asking if I could be more professional in the future. And you can hear it, can't you? The deep shiver of malicious compliance vibrating through my offended being. So the next morning, I start issuing professional lease violation notices. One for the extra residents of the unit, hubby and boyfriend, one for the dog, and a few additional ones for building concerns I noted during the showings. They ignored the violation notice, which I sent by certified mail, and thoughtfully, also by email. I decided to be even more professional, so 30 days later, I issue a 5-day notice to vacate. I also called their mom, who's their emergency contact, as an eviction notice is an emergency. And did I mention that their lease was due to end just a few weeks later? But it would be unprofessional of me to let these violations slide until then. 3 days later, they'd magically sent me all the information I requested, removed the other dog, licensed the first dog, and gotten the required pet insurance. They moved out on their lease termination date, and skipped out on their last electric bill and left the unit in damaged condition. And despite my professional security deposit disposition statement and request for payment, they ignored all those notices until I stated that I would proceed to small claims court by X date for the total due beyond their security deposit. On X date, they replied, stating they didn't think it was fair that they should have to cover damages to the unit or pay any more money towards their utility bill. 2 months later, they were in the lobby of the courthouse, sitting across from each other on the uncomfortable waiting room benches. They're laughing among themselves about how they're gonna get their full security deposit back. Meanwhile, I'm just quietly reviewing my presentation notes to the judge and my sizable stack of evidence, photographs, videos, etc. This was my first time in court, but I wasn't laughing, I was preparing. 1 hour later, we're back in the lobby, and their mom's trying to write me a check for the full amount of the judgment. She doesn't have a pen, her kids don't have a pen. I, however, have a pen. I cheerfully offer my pen and she writes the check and hands it to me. I was so proud of myself for not saying any of the sassy things in my head in that moment. You know why? Because I was being professional, as I'd been from that moment he'd left that voicemail. As a last note, I do acknowledge that it would have been better if I hadn't brought my children. However, if you have kids, you understand that sometimes they simply have to go where you go. Oh my goodness, I bet the husband regrets leaving that one voicemail. Like, did they not realize how many things OP let slide? I'm just glad it ended well, because in some places, tenants do have a lot of power over landlords, and I've even known landlords who have lost to Karen renters before. And this person shares their comment and says, "At the end of it all, I would have smiled, waved, and said, 'How's that for a professional?' and then walked my happy little ass away." So this one's a little long. When my wife and I were starting out, we had a little old rental house downtown that we leased to students. When we moved out of country for a job, I figured it would be easier to rent to one family than to chase around 6 broke students for rent. The first family we put in there turned out to be a bad choice on my part. The woman who lived there was 40 years old, and it was fine for the first 4 months or so. However, when I visited in person, the house was noticeably getting gross. They weren't taking care of things. Now, this might have been somewhat forgivable, but then she stopped paying rent on time. To make matters worse, there was a plumbing issue that sounded expensive. The toilets were backing up, and sewage was soaking the carpets in the basement. The whole place stank. We had a plumber come in and run a camera down the pipes to see what was happening. He informed me that the clog was a result of a buildup of needles. I asked him, why would somebody put sewing needles down there? And he said to me, no, the kind one might use for drugs. I then opted to pay $1,000 to have them use high pressure to flush out the system. Unfortunately, my house was nearly 100 years old, so the high pressure destroyed the clay connector to the city's sewage system. The only way to fix it was to shut down a major residential road and dig to it for $30,000. Insurance wasn't in any hurry to pay either, and I, of course, didn't have that kind of cash sitting around at the moment, and our craptacular renter was still there. I wanted to evict her, but it would be a long process, and I knew that she would fight tooth and nail to stay, as she didn't want to go back to her parents, who lived just down the street. By this point, my house resembled a hoarder's home, and with the plumbing issue, I suspected that drugs were being dealt and done in there. Now, rather than evicting my tenant, I called the health department because they were living with no running water and a porta potty they rented in the backyard. It was gross. They also had 2 girls there under the age of 10. It took a visit from a team of sheriffs to get her out, and only well after the property was condemned. When she finally did leave, she left about 100 pounds of rotting meat on the front lawn. She also left the house a giant mess, and she stole many of my things. But I was so relieved that she was gone that I almost didn't care. She was a major source of stress in my life and in my marriage. It ended up taking several hundred hours and over $50,000 to fix up the house. Eventually, though, insurance came through for part of it. I tried not to be resentful about the situation, because being an addict and living in a condemned building is its own hell. There wasn't anything I could feel good about doing to her. She was already doomed to live poorly based on her own choices. And by this point in life, I felt like I was above anything I could do to her. Besides, she had 2 kids. But here's the part that left my jaw on the floor. She actually had the nerve to text me to ask for a character referral for a new place, since she didn't have anyone else. I was dumbfounded, but I texted back a thumbs up, because maybe I could save the next guy. Eventually, I did get the call from the next guy asking about her. The guy was an a-hole to me on the phone though. He was talking over me and talking down to me. He was an expert landlord doing his due diligence. I tried to get my story in about her, but then I paused. I listened to him talk down to me some more, thinking, I'm a total stranger, what the hell? And then I waited until it was my turn. I told him, you know what, she was great. I had some major plumbing issues, otherwise, she would still be with me. Also, she's got quite a cute family. She ends up getting the place, and she messaged me back to thank me. I never heard from either of them again. Talk about paying it ahead, and what an unexpected wild twist at the end of this post where OP just sent their nightmare renter to the new landlord. And this is why people should live by the rule, if you're not an a-hole to me, I won't be one to you. I wonder how she treated her next home. So when I was 18 years old, my dad gifted me a house with 2 stories. I'm extremely thankful. We're not upper class, but my dad bought this house for a cheap price tag a long time ago. I know that this was an extreme privilege, and I'm forever grateful for this. The layout of the building is like an apartment, but it's a house. So basically, each story has its own separate entryway, its own kitchen and bathroom. I live upstairs while renting out the downstairs. My boyfriend moved in with me about 3 months ago, and we've been together for 6 months. I've not asked him for money, neither for utilities or to pay me any rent. The only thing he contributes to is groceries, and that we split 50-50. And here's the thing, I haven't brought up that I own the building, as it's not something I tell many people. If people ask me, I of course tell them I own it. But if they assume that I'm a renter, then they can believe that. The topic of a landlord, the renter downstairs, or the owner of the building has not been something we've talked about. That said, this last Tuesday, the renter comes up to tell me that her freezer stopped working. I answered the door, and my boyfriend heard us talking, I suppose. I went downstairs to take a look, and we came to the conclusion that she would buy a new one. She would then send me the receipt, and I would give her the money. She was very grateful for the solution. When I went upstairs, my boyfriend asked if it could be fixed. I told him no, but she was gonna buy a new one and I would pay for it. Hearing me say that, he looked at me like I was crazy, and then asked me why the hell would I pay for her freezer. I told him because I'm her landlord and the freezer was there when she started renting. I would stand for the cost. He then asked me if I was serious, to which I said I was. He then began screaming at me, asking why the hell would I hold this information from him, and that I was an evil person. I said I was sorry for not telling him, but I didn't think it would matter. This is when my boyfriend said that he couldn't believe he was with someone who is a landlord. That all of us just use people for money, and the only thing that, quote, we people care about is money, and would rather have people be homeless than offering affordable rent. And I want to note, the downstairs is 1 kitchen, 1 bath, and 4 other rooms. I charge $500 in rent. I understand that many people have had trouble with landlords, but I try my best to be a good one. He then demanded that I give him 50% of the money that I make from rent, or else I was just as bad as he thought. I told him no, of course, and he hasn't talked to me since Tuesday. I have tried telling him that I'm truly sorry, but he doesn't answer me at all. So was I really the a-hole for not telling him? In my opinion, heck no. Like, the dude is so entitled for even wanting half the rent money that OP takes from the tenants. Like, has that man lost his mind? The guy doesn't even pay rent himself, like OP said. She doesn't owe that guy a damn thing. And how wild is it for OP to even think she would be the a-hole in this situation? I just hope she reconsidered this relationship after that, because clearly the dude's a leech. This person comments, yep, that's a huge red flag. The guy was more than happy to leech off of you, not pay rent, not even offering, but the moment he found out that you own the place, he suddenly demands half the money. And he has the cheek to criticize you. And landlords living off other people paying rent is evil, but his solution is for him to get half that money, so it's evil unless he gets his cut. It's very clear what kind of person he is. I totally agree. And again, I hope OP realizes it, because it just takes one bad person to ruin a good thing. And guys, let me know your thoughts. If you're in a situation like this, are you kicking the person to the curb or what? And that, my friends, brings us to another end of r/EntitledPeople. Guys, if you enjoyed the episode, give it a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy stories. And if you missed the last episode on the channel, it's an r/EntitledPeople episode. Another one where psycho Karens think they own houses, other people's houses. It's such a wild episode, so go check it out if you haven't. And myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.